Good morning to all of you. On behalf of the Department of English, University of Gour, let me welcome you to another session of this online lecture series that we are organizing. Today, we are very happy to have in our midst Professor Niladri Chatterjee, a sound scholar and a remarkable speaker who is going to tackle the issue of the queer, the journey from ontology to epistemology, the shift from an adjective to a verb. That is what he is going to talk about. He has been accommodative enough to talk about, at least agree to talk about not only gender theory, but also to ground the lecture in literature, in literary components. So, Niladri Chatterjee has been teaching at the Department of English, Kalyani University for the last so many years. His areas of specialization are cultural studies and masculinity studies. He has been a recipient of the Fulbright Scholarship and the British Council's Charles Wallace Fellowship as well. He has co-edited The Muffled Heart, the stories of the disempowered male, and of late he has just written a work of fiction, The Scholar. So Niladri is going to mesmerize us today, as I hope, network permitting, obviously. So without further ado, let me hand over the reins of this session to the capable hands of Niladri Chatterjee. Professor Niladri Chatterjee, this is over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amit, for that very, very kind introduction. Thanks also go in general to the Department of English, Gour University, for so kindly asking me to speak at a webinar today. Amit had insisted when he spoke to me about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, that I should talk about queer theory. I should talk about also I should touch on masculinity studies. So I will jump into the lecture immediately. Now, what I really wish to do is talk about the way in which identity has been regarded as political over the last 3 centuries almost, about 2.5 centuries. Identity has been recognized as being political. And where we stand right now, we simply cannot think about our identities in any other way. So the trajectory of this is very long. I'm certainly not going to spend too much time talking about how we became aware of the fact that our identities are political. I'll very quickly flag some events, and I'm sure you will be able to connect the dots and to figure out where we are today and how we got here. So really, initially, as you may very well know, this goes out to both PG and UG students, and of course, the teachers who are here, that initially we lived in a universe, we lived in a society where we regarded God or divinity as being the all-powerful sort of entity which conditions our lives, which regulates our lives. And that provided us with a kind of certainty. And then, of course, during the Renaissance, with the advent of humanism, there was a shift. So therefore, God at the center of the universe was, to a certain extent, this is a gross oversimplification, but I'll just very quickly sort of run through it because you know the details of that. God was replaced by the human being. And of course, so that was the first, I would say, a political act as well, to sort of, because if you think about what is politics, then politics is basically about the either being aware that one is empowered or the state of being aware that one is disempowered. So either way, awareness is political. right? So whether you're empowered or whether you're disempowered, either awareness is a political awareness. So therefore, there was this awareness during the Renaissance that the human being was needed to be centered in the way in which we thought about the world, the way in which we thought about society. And that is something which remained in place for a very long time. So there was this assumption that all human beings are equal. But of course, as we very well know, that human beings were certainly not equal. As I'm fond of saying, that what we regard as humanism is very often manism, because while we talk about humanity, very often unconsciously what we are thinking about is manity. So the way in which, in a very strange way, the human and the man, they became interchangeable. Yeah. So therefore, the man was the human and the human was the man. And so therefore, any human being that was not a man somehow did not quite figure in our understanding of what the society consists of, right? And so therefore, women certainly fell into the category where they simply did not count. Of course, during the Renaissance, you certainly had some women, rare exceptions, who somehow managed to have a stake in patriarchal power, or indeed in anti-patriarchal power. But of course, the vast majority of women were certainly regarded as being the property of their men. So therefore, this continued for a very long time, until we come to the 18th century. And of course, in 18th century, as you very well know, towards the end of the 18th century, there is this tremendous sense of a political awareness that comes upon the people of France. We have the French Revolution, because we realize with one shock that all human beings are certainly not equal. Some human beings have more power, some human beings have less. And this is where I think, we all think about the French Revolution as being this sort of wonderful event where the monarchy was overthrown and, as it were, people power asserted itself. But I don't think it is quite so simple, because of the very reason that what the French Revolution basically did was to celebrate, the three supposedly, democratic virtues of equality, liberty, and fraternity. I've got no problems with equality. I've got no problems with liberty. I do, however, have an enormous problem with fraternity. And the way in which the term fraternity continues to be bandied about as a term that is genderless, as a term that is sexless, as a term that is, neutral, there I think is a real problem, because fraternity, as anybody will tell you, is certainly not a gender neutral term. Fraternity is meant to be an association of brothers, that is to say, an association of men. So there is a very clear gender specificity to the term fraternity, but see how even when the French Revolution is pretending to be for the common masses, even in its aspirations, it still manages to somehow preserve patriarchy in a way in which we don't very often recognize. So patriarchy is therefore preserved in the French Revolution. And I think this preservation of patriarchy in revolutionary activities is something that has remained, a proper plague, as it were, on all revolutionary activities, including the revolutionary activities that happened very, very recently in America, where Black Lives Matter effectively became, as you may know, effectively became about Black heterosexual men's lives matter, right? So therefore, while people were saying Black Lives Matter, in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, there were Black trans persons, there were Black gay men who were basically being asked to stay away from the demonstrations because they were not wanted. So then a new slogan had to be mobilized, which said, all Black lives matter, because they figured out that there was a real danger. There was a real danger that Black Lives Matter was basically becoming about Black heterosexual cisgender men. So do you see that whether it is the French Revolution or whether it is the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, there is a way in which patriarchy continues to, as it were, appropriate supposedly socially progressive movements to constantly foreground a kind of masculinity and constantly foreground a certain kind of heteronormativity. This is something that patriarchy is extremely good at doing. Yes, the way in which patriarchy can subvert, patriarchy can scupper movements that are socially progressive to then hijack those movements and turning those progressive movements into regressive movements by foregrounding certain very basic masculinist patriarchal energies. So whether we look at, I had digressed into the Black Lives Matter movement, but if we go a little further back, if we go to the 18th century, we there find Mary Wollstonecraft, who is writing her famous sort of, tract, as it were, in which she talks about, the need for women to be educated. But of course, as we very well know, Mary Wollstonecraft, was being unconsciously patriarchal because she was saying that women need to be educated so that they can become, better wives and mothers. So therefore, there was a way in which the identity of the woman was still being tied to motherhood and sort of managing the household and being a good wife. So that is something which we, of course, we moved away from that. We don't justify women's education so that they can become good mothers and good housewives. At least we don't do that at a feminist level. We certainly do that at the level of state, because even now we have got people in government who are constantly saying, yes, you must educate your daughters, because if you educate your daughters, they will be educated mothers to their children. So therefore, it is very interesting how the education of the daughter is still being linked to her reproductivity. It is as if that even her education is linked to the productivity of her womb. It is linked to her uterus, right? So therefore, there is a way in which patriarchy has consistently tried to appropriate socially progressive movements. And we certainly see that in the 19th century, well, actually early 20th century, when the Russian Revolution happens, right? Because Russian Revolution, again, in a kind of a repeat of the French Revolution of 200 years ago, the Russian Revolution also overthrows a totalitarian monarchy and also supposedly is replaced by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, we know now how the dictatorship of the proletariat effectively began to function, because the proletariat certainly did not have power. Only a few people had power, and these few people were all men. Women had absolutely no space there. There is this one single woman figure, Alexandra Kollontai, but she was very, very quickly sidelined as well. So now when we think about the Russian Revolution, we only think of men. It is not that women were not a part of it, but the way the history was written, women were excised out of it. So therefore, by the time we come to the 1960s, I'm rushing forward very quickly. By the time we come to the 1960s, this is where women begin to reassert their identities. But this time, it isn't so much about the public identity, because women have since then in the 1920s, in various countries, women won the right to vote. women certainly began to go into educational institutions. So those public rights had already been acquired, but there still remained tremendous patriarchal vigilance on women's private lives. So therefore, what we really begin to see happening in the 1960s is that there is an acknowledgement, again, you know this very well, that the personal is political, so therefore sex begins to be talked about. We have sex-positive feminists who gradually begin to assert their voices to say that, women must have right over their sexuality. But of course, when they were talking primarily about their sexuality, it was still increasingly being tied to reproduction. So therefore, much of the debate was regarding abortion. But of course, there were also some women who were identifying themselves as lesbian, and they were saying that this is something which we really need to focus on as well, is that there are many, many women whose sexual lives don't necessarily revolve around men. And this is where I think we identify one of the problems of the way in which gender studies and sexuality studies sort of, became entangled in a kind of a completely unexpected antagonism. This was an antagonism that was not premeditated, but it just happened that way. There are several antagonisms there. Now, this is where I will start going into some detail as to how those antagonisms gradually began to accrete. They gradually began to form, how these antagonisms begin to form. So I am going to start in the 1950s. So I'm going to start a little before the 1960s. What is happening in the 1950s? Now, in the 1950s, you have the creation in America of a group called the Matashin Society. Now, the Matashin Society were basically consisted of one man. I mean, there were some other men, but one particular man, is regarded as being the heart and soul of the Matashin Society, which is Frank Kamini. Now, what Frank Kamini did was he was an out homosexual man in the 1950s, and he basically wanted to be respected and valued as a full citizen of America, taking also into account his sexuality. Now, how did Frank Kamini do that? Now, Frank Kamini did that in ways that are going to be very interesting for us to understand how these identitarian social movements, they draw from each other, is something that we can see very clearly in the way in which Frank Kamini envisions this particular movement of the Matashin Society. Now, Frank Kamini drew a lot of his political sort of presentation, his political activity from the burgeoning civil rights movement, which was primarily for the African Americans, right? So because in the 1950s, there was large-scale lynching that was happening. Black men were being routinely beaten up and killed and sort of hung from trees and all of that. So there was a rapidly developing civil rights movement that was happening. Now, what we really have to understand is that when the civil rights movement was beginning to take shape, the leaders of the civil rights movement, their political stance was that we must reach out to the larger population of the society and tell them that we are just as respectable as you. So can we please make a note of the notion of respectability? Because this is something that I'll come back to much later as well. What is respectable? What is not respectable? What is the politics of respectability? That is something that I'm going to come to a little later. So they decided that, we are going to be respectable. Many of you would be interested to know that when these sort of civil rights marches were happening in the 1950s, the leaders of the civil rights movement, they were telling the people who were participating in the walk, be dressed as if you are going to church. let us just remember that, right? So therefore, be dressed as if you are going to church. So therefore, please present yourselves as nice, respectable, middle-class people. You know, we are not thieves, we are not robbers, we are not delinquents. You know, we are just like you. The only slight difference, of course, is that our skin color is different, but apart from that, we are just like you. We are respectable, tax-paying citizens. So this idea of respectability being used as a political weapon is something that Frank Kamini learned from the civil rights movement. Now, what did Frank Kamini do? He then told the gay men, by the way, this was exclusively for gay men, right? So therefore, this was not about lesbians. So he told the gay men that dress respectably. Dress respectably. So therefore, you know, Frank Kamini, he would wear a suit and a tie and a hat. And a lot of gay men who were not middle class, who were not supposedly respectable, who didn't have the kind of establishmentarian energy that Frank Kamini had, they would openly make fun of him because they used to say, you know, what are you doing? You know, because the politics of Frank Kamini was very much an assimilationist politics. It was the politics of saying, oh, please love me because I'm just like you. So there was a way in which the initial sort of, you know, gay rights movement was all about buying into the mainstream. Please love me because I'm just like you. And this buying into the mainstream is something that went on for quite some time until, of course, as you very well know, something happened on the night of 27th June, 1969. Now, there have been various other sort of histories about LGBT activism that have subsequently come out and said that, you know, there were raids that were happening in other sort of, you know, gay and lesbian bars in America before Stonewall. And there was also resistance in those bars as well. But it is the way in which the LGBT history has sort of stabilized that we regard 1969, 27, 28, 29 June as being this absolute, you know, watershed moment. For those of us who don't know what happened on the 27th of June, 1969, well, this was happening in New York at the Stonewall bar, which was frequented by working class gay men, working class lesbians, working class transgender people, whether trans men or trans women. And they used to congregate there and they would be subjected to repeated raids by the New York police. Well, on the 27th of June, such a raid took place. But this time around, of course, you know, the clients, the customers of that bar, they didn't run away or they didn't give in to the police arrests as they had been doing over the last few years. They fought back. So their fighting back lasted for 3 days. And as a result of that, what began was a gradual coming together of the gay men's group, of the lesbians, of the trans persons groups. And they all realized that instead of fighting within ourselves, we have to fight the common evil of patriarchy, right? So therefore, there was a lot of, feminists also who initially joined forces. Of course, something begins to happen later, which is going to reveal a certain conflict, a schism between the trans persons and the feminists. But that is something that I'll come to later. So initially, what we really are going to look at is the way in which the Stonewall riots of 1969 was very much a coming together of the gay men, of the lesbians, of the trans persons. They all came together to fight a common enemy. And as a result of that, you had the formation of what eventually becomes the LGBT movement, because the first Pride March happens in New York in 1970. So what we really have, therefore, is that so what happens in 1970 is you've got the first Pride March. And what the first Pride March does is that it sees the coming together of forces. So you've got the lesbians and the gay men and the trans persons, and they all sort of come together. However, and this is really what is so unfortunate, is that certain schisms begin to appear. Oh, by the way, when the march was happening in 1970, it wasn't, the trans persons were to a certain extent represented, but bisexuality wasn't represented to that extent. So it was very much a gay and lesbian march. That, I think, is something that we probably need to take into account. Now, what begins to happen is that, remember, this is happening in 1970. Around this time, around early 70s, in one or two American universities, there are some professors who start offering courses in what was then called gay and lesbian studies. So this is happening around early 1970s. Now, this is where I would want to go a little further back and talk about the way in which terminologies became activated, right? So I am just going to give you a very quick rundown of the way in which terms were created. Those of you who want to get the chronology later, I will be able to repeat them once I have done with this, but I'm just very quickly going to run down through the sort of a potted history of terminology, right? So therefore, in 1830, we have the first recorded use of the term asexual. But I think asexual, when it was used in the 1830, that was being used more in the case of plants and not so much in the case of human beings. That would be my guess. The term homosexual was coined in 1869. The term lesbian was coined or became current in 1890. In 1892, you had the coinage of bisexuality, and many of you would be interested to know heterosexuality. So therefore, heterosexuality, the term heterosexuality was coined later, much later than the term homosexual. So those of you who are, those of you who enjoy the game of who came first, you may be interested to know that the homosexual came first and the heterosexual came later. So this is just a little bit of a fun fact for you. By the time we come to 1920s, the term gay begins to be used in the context of the homosexual, although it does not become current until about 40 years later. But the term gay, which is associated with effeminacy, which is associated with homosexuality, begins to circulate around 1920. 1941, we have got transsexuality. 1957, we have got transsexual. And in 1967, we have the term homoerotophobia, which has now, of course, metamorphosed into what we usually call homophobia. So homophobia began life as homoerotophobia in 1967. I would also want to mention that 1967 is also the year in which homosexuality among consenting adults becomes decriminalized in the UK. In England, it becomes decriminalized. Okay, but I would then move on to 1977, because I think that is a rather important year. This is a year that, I think gender studies courses should take note of, because something extremely important happened, but this is a document that many of us are unaware of. Now, this is the Combahee River Collective Statement. Now, the Combahee River Collective Statement is very, very important because way back in 1977, we already have feminists who are talking about intersectionality. So those of us who think that intersectionality actually happens, happened in the last few years with Kimberly Crenshaw, no, I think intersectionality can be traced back at least to 1977, because in this very, very feminist document, and I think many of you would actually be interested in hearing exactly what it has to say about the men. Because it says very clearly, this is the first statement of intersectionality that we have, in which men are included in the feminist project. Men are included in the feminist project. And it says over here that they're included through acknowledging that. This is the statement. So I'm actually reading out from the statement. We do not have the misguided notion that it is their maleness per se what they are. So way back in 19, they are already acknowledging that we are not going to practice a politics that is either inclusive or exclusive of somebody's biological sex. Now, biological sex, as we now know, of course, doesn't exist. Biological sex is a contradiction in terms. Sex is always already gender. But of course, keeping all of that aside, at least in the 1970s, they were saying that if the feminist movement has to go forward, men have to be included. And this extremely important document is something that we should really talk about much more. This comes out in 1977. Now, what begins to happen is that by the time we come to late 1980s, there is therefore a greater discontent that comes within the feminist movement, that comes within the gay and lesbian movement, because there is a protest that comes from within the movement that the terms gay and lesbian does not sufficiently include everyone, because there are many of us who are neither gay nor lesbian. We can be bisexual. There are many of us who do not identify primarily through sexuality, but through gender, namely transgender. We are feeling increasingly left out. So therefore, this is where, I think it is rather important that we are having this discussion on queer theory right now, because this year, you would be very interested to know, this year actually marks the 30th anniversary of the resignification of the term queer. So previously, queer, we all very know, used to be a term that meant odd, strange, bizarre, unusual, freaky. But something happened in February 1990. Now, what happened in February 1990 is that a conference was called. This conference was called at University of California, Santa Cruz, where Teresa de Lauretis was a professor of the history of consciousness. So her position was that she was professor in the history of consciousness. And Teresa de Lauretis called this conference. She convened this conference in February 1990 at University of California, Santa Cruz, at which we have the inauguration in 1990 of the term queer theory. So queer theory stops being an adjective. He is a queer man, right? Or he is queer, or she is queer. So it stops being an adjective, And from 1990 onwards, it also becomes, stops being only an adjective, I think should be the correct way of putting it. It stops being exclusively an adjective, and now it becomes an adjective as well as a verb. So therefore, now we have the activation of to queer, queering. I will queer this. So therefore, queer becomes a verb, to queer becomes an act. It isn't anymore an existence, it becomes a politics. So therefore, what we really begin to find from 1990 onwards, and of course 1990, many of you will know, is also the year of the publication of Judith Butler's absolutely landmark book, Gender Trouble. So this year, 2020, we are celebrating not only the advent of queer theory, but we are also celebrating the 30th anniversary of the publication of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. So what we really have in 1990 is an awareness that the term queer is perhaps much more generous. It is a much more inclusive term because it is a politics and it isn't an identity that you are born with. And this, I think, is something that many students of mine have asked on several occasions. They have said, sir, can a heterosexual person be queer? I am perfectly happy to answer over and over and over again, yes, yes, yes. You can be heterosexual and you can be queer. Your sexual desires have nothing to do with your politics. Just as nobody is born communist, nobody is born queer. We acquire communism just as we acquire queerness. It is learned. So there is a way in which we are in need of practicing queerness. That is something that we really should be concerned about. Yeah, we need to practice queerness. Now, how does queerness show itself? How does queerness practice? What is the practice of queerness? Okay, now in order to do that, I would take recourse to a very old definition, old in the sense that it is sort of a couple of decades old, and a newer definition. Now, the old definition is that which has been circulated by Michael Warner. So therefore, queer theory or queer studies is resistance to all that is normative, right? So resistance to the regimes of the normal. So then what queer theory does is that it critiques, it questions the normal. It asks you, what is normal? How is that normal created? What is natural? How is the natural created, right? So therefore, there is a way in which what queer theory does is that it forces us to examine assumptions that we have about what we think of as normal, what we think of as natural. So that is Michael Warner's definition. But in 2020, okay, many of you may be aware of this journal that you can certainly check out called Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, GLQ, which is published from Duke University. Now, GLQ has been in publication since 1993. So this journal called Gay and Lesbian Quarterly is 25 years old. In a recent issue of Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, we have a new way, not a new way, but certainly an important way of looking at the queer, which is the queer customary. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the queer customary. Why not? Why don't I just give you the definition of the queer customary, the way in which it is written about in this particular issue of the GLQ, Gay and Lesbian Quarterly. This is volume 26, number 3, which is published this year. Okay, so this is what the journal says about the queer customary. What is queer customary? They say queering, I'm going to read this a couple of times so that it registers. Queering the customary specifically entails the unsettling of expected roles, right? So queering the customary specifically entails the unsettling of expected roles, subjectivities, and forms of personhood that are normatively prescribed by customary practices. I think that's a remarkably important definition in the sense that, so what are the things that are being done over here? The most important verb over here, as you may have already realized by now, is unsettling. So unsettling is the crucial verb. Okay, let's move on to the other ones now. Unsettling of what? Unsettling of expected roles. This is what you have to do. That is what you have to do. You are dressed like this, so this is what you have to do. So in sociology, it is called sex roles. And some may also talk about it as gender roles, right? So therefore, expected roles, how do you unsettle them? So therefore, unsettling of expected roles is the queering of the customary subjectivities. Right? So what is subjectivity? The consciousness of who am I, subject as opposed to object. So therefore, I am a man. Okay. So then you can trouble that. So you can certainly, wear a sari. You can wear a sari, you can wear jewelry, you can have a full growth of beard, and then you can go up to a conference and then you say, hi, I'm a man. To which they're going to say, oh, but if you're a man, you're not allowed to wear a sari. To which you're going to say, well, who said it? Where is it written? Which law am I breaking? So therefore, there is a way in which you can unsettle subjectivities. You can claim the subjectivity of being a man, but then you can create a kind of masculinity which does not conform to the way in which masculinity is regarded. So therefore, what are you doing? You're unsettling subjectivity. Okay. And of course, forms of personhood. Who you are as a person. How are you recognized as a person? Do you agree to the way in which you're recognized as a person? Are you satisfied with the identity that society has dumped on you? Chances are, if we are very honest, most of us are not satisfied with the identity that is dumped by society on us. We are not satisfied with it. But we continue with it because we believe, dada jhamela korbo keno. ঠিক আছে, এই বেশ ভালো আছি. So therefore, there is a way in which we don't want to trouble the waters very much. We are like, ঠিক আছে দাদা, জীবনে অনেক কমপ্লিকেশন আছে, এসব নিয়ে আর মাথা ঘামাইয়া কি লাভ? What we don't understand is that if you do not resist these regimes of the normal, these sort of, expected roles, the oppression of expected roles, of subjectivities, of personhood, you think that this is unnecessary, but this has got very, very far-reaching consequences, because this actually has tremendous effects on law. It has effects on custom. It has effects on knowledge. Yes. Somebody wrote in the Telegraph today, not somebody, but a very famous academic, wrote in the Telegraph editorial page today that acquisition of knowledge has now become political. I couldn't quite understand the now, because as long as knowledge has existed, it has, always been political. So I couldn't quite see where the now was coming from. But anyway, be that as it may. So everything is political. Now, what does queering the customary do? What does the queer customary do? It makes us understand that what we understand as the customary, everyday, quotidian, can also be queered. And if we are very, very conscious about it, we will realize that we are queering it, consciously or unconsciously. We are constantly tinkering with the customary. None of us, and I'm going to say this with 100% authority, none of us lead 100% normative lives. We don't. We are breaking normativities every single way. But there is the way in which we have somehow managed to find a way to project our normative selves in order to gain a kind of social purchase, in order to gain a kind of political purchase. But nobody, if we are honest, has normative lives. So therefore, normativity is something that we are questioning in our lives all the time. Can we please therefore acknowledge that we are unconsciously queering the customary anyway? And again, you do not have to be gay to be queer. You do not have to be lesbian to be queer. You do not have to be bisexual to be queer. In fact, let me tell you that you can be gay and you can be patriarchal. I'm going to spend some time there as well. You can be lesbian and you can be patriarchal. Okay, so now that we've come to my favorite part, how you can be a lesbian and you can be patriarchal. How can you be a feminist and be patriarchal? Okay, this is it. What begins to happen in the early feminist movement, not early, I mean around the 60s, what begins to happen is that you have some feminists who believe primarily, first of all, that lesbians should not be a part of the feminist movement. So there is an actual expulsion, there is an actual excision of the lesbian from the feminist movement. That was also very much the case in India. Because even in India, when the feminist movement was taking shape, for a very long time, Indian feminists would not engage with the lesbians, right? So therefore, there was this kind of schism that was already happening in the feminist movement. And now what we have, but of course, subsequently, lesbians are accepted. And you know, now, of course, lesbians have a full access, I hope, to the whole feminist apparatus that used to be previously denied to them. Oh, but now a new battle has broken out. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term TERF, T-E-R-F. So a TERF is a trans-exclusive radical feminist, right? So therefore a TERF, T-E-R-F, is somebody who basically believes that trans persons, whether trans man or trans woman, they should not have access to feminist movements. So now we have this extraordinary battle, a pitched battle that has broken out, in which you have feminists who are writing books, unfortunately, which are excluding trans persons. I don't have much time. I think I've got about 8 minutes left. So I'm very quickly going to move on to some literary readings, but I will have to mention at least one book which has turned out to be extremely toxic. It has turned out to be, yes.
Niladri, you can go on.
Okay, but even then I'll try and truncate it a little bit because I'm much more interested in taking questions. But I will, I'll just mention one book which comes from somebody that I would certainly identify as a TERF. And this is Sheila Jeffries. Now, Sheila Jeffries is a rather astonishing book. Is Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of the politics of transgenderism, which came out in 2015, is an absolutely appalling piece of work, a feminist work, mind you. It is an appalling work because what it basically tries to do is to, as it were, reclaim the feminist for cis women, which is a terribly dangerous thing to do. So what the broad, and you know, if you think that, you know, these feminists are in a minority, well, let me tell you that there are some very, very famous voices who are very trans exclusionary. I'll just give you one more name, which I think you'll recognize immediately, Germaine Greer. So Germaine Greer, right? So we all worship at her feet. But look at the way in which she consistently has said that feminism should be basically for persons assigned female at birth, gender assigned female at birth. So there is a way in which, do you realize how unconsciously patriarchy is working over here? Because on the one hand, early feminist movement said that, biology is not destiny. And then in a very strange way, they are going back on that word by basically saying, yes, biology is destiny. So if you are born with a vagina, only then do you have access to feminist movements. If you are born with a penis, but if you claim to be a woman, I'm sorry, we don't have space for you. It is an astonishing way in which feminism has unconsciously become patriarchal. Some feminism, thankfully not all. I will therefore move on very quickly to talk about the way in which the queer has functioned, is functioning today. And over here, I would also want to alert us to something that I think we should be very, very careful about, which is a kind of legal liberalism. We have to be aware of a liberal constitutionalism. And we have to be very, very alert to a national appropriation of queerness and the process of gentrification. I will very quickly sort of round up the political side of my lecture before going on to the readings. And when I'm talking about legal liberalism, when I'm talking about liberal constitutionalism and the national appropriation of queerness, I would basically alert you to the verdict that the Honorable Supreme Court declared in 2018, right? So therefore, what happened on the 6th of September 2018 is that homosexuality between adult persons, consensual and in private, became legal. I mean, it became decriminalized. So there was widespread celebration, but what I'm very worried about it is that in this particular judgment, which was primarily supposed to be about right to sexuality, but the judgment in a very, very strange way, and I've spoken about it elsewhere as well, that the judgment in a very strange way becomes about love. And I am very, very suspicious of the way in which love operates in patriarchy. Because when you activate love to sex, something extremely dangerous happens. Sexuality becomes sentimentalized. And the moment you sentimentalize sexuality, you're immediately laying the path for marriage. And of course, many of you may know that now there is a movement that is forming within the LGBT community for the legalization of same-sex marriage. I am going to put it on record over here that I'm against it because I just believe that, there are many, many other things that we need to fight for. Marriage, honestly, should not be a priority. But there is a way in which marriage or gay marriage is going to have a very widespread support. And the reason why it is going to have widespread support is because through marriage, we can now control the sexuality of gays and lesbians and bisexual people the way in which we have very successfully managed to, well, I mean, I don't think very successfully, but we think we have very successfully managed to control the sexuality of so-called heterosexual people. So the way in which we have controlled the sexuality of heterosexual people, now we are very interested in controlling the sexuality of LGBT people by saying, yes, of course, isn't it wonderful? And how many times have I, howled in anger when I have looked at the slogan, love is love. I find the slogan, love is love, incredibly toxic because I believe that if you're constantly going to talk about love, but actually mean sex, what you're doing is this incredibly dangerous patriarchal act. You're sentimentalizing sex, and that is something that LGBT movement did not start off with. So there is a way in which the queer is now about resisting this kind of legal liberalism. It is about resisting national appropriation of queerness, and it is about resisting a certain gentrification that we now see everywhere. And with that, I am going to finish the the political part of this particular talk before honoring Amit's wish and moving on to a few readings. And the readings that I'm going to do very quickly are going to be about how queerness operates in literature, how queerness operates in writing, because queerness is very much about ambiguity. Yes, so therefore I think ambiguity is because ambiguity is very subversive, right? Ambiguity is very subversive. You're saying something, but I'm not sure what is it that you're saying. I think you're saying this, but I'm not sure if that is what you mean. So there is a kind of ambiguity that is there in literature per se, in poetry especially. And it is this ambiguity which is where I think queerness can be located. Now, I am going to, the first reading that I shall do, many of you may already be familiar with this, those of you who watch my YouTube videos. The first reading will be from what is arguably the first Indian gay autobiography. The first Indian gay autobiography, which was written by the Emperor Babur. This is a Babarnama. So I am going to read this, this little extract from Babarnama, in which he talks about falling in love with this boy. In those leisurely days, I discovered in myself a strange inclination. Nay, as the verse says, I maddened and afflicted myself for a boy in the camp bazaar, his very name, Baburi, fitting in. Up till then, I had had no inclination for anyone. Indeed, of love and desire, either by hearsay or experience, I had not heard, I had not taught. At that time, I composed Persian couplets, one or two at a time. This is one of them. May none be as I, humbled and wretched and lovesick, no beloved as thou art to me, cruel and careless. From time to time, Baburi used to come to my presence, but out of modesty and bashfulness. This is a man who was the emperor of India. He is talking about modesty and bashfulness. Modesty and bashfulness, I could never look straight at him. How then could I make conversation and recital? In my joy and agitation, I could not thank him for coming. How was it possible for me to reproach him with going away? What power had I to command the duty of service to myself? One day during that time of desire and passion, when I was going with companions along a land and suddenly met him face to face, I got into such a state of confusion that I almost went right off. To look straight at him or to put words together was impossible. With 100 torments and shames I went on. A Persian couplet of Muhammad Salih's came to my mind. I'm abashed with shame when I see my friend. My companions look at me. I look the other way. That couplet suited the case wonderfully well. In that frothing up of desire and passion and under that stress of youthful folly, I used to wander barehead, barefoot through the street and lane, orchard and vineyard. I showed civility neither to friend nor to stranger, took no care of myself or of others. So look at the way in which Babur is talking about his love for Baburi and the language that he uses. The language, if you see, this is where queerness lies. If you had replaced Baburi with a girl, there would have been no need to change the language. The language could still remain identical and it would not make any difference. But over here, the language that we are familiar in an absolutely heterosexual, heteronormative term, that same language is being activated by a man to talk about his love for another, well, for a boy. So language therefore is equivocal. Language is ambiguous, and it is this elasticity of language which I think gives it a kind of queerness, which I think a lot of queer writers down the years have exploited. I had two poems by a person who is much more famous as a sculptor, as an artist, from the Renaissance, Michelangelo. But I am going to read, I mean, there are two sonnets by Michelangelo that I think are absolutely magical, but for the shortage of time, I will simply read one, which is my absolute favorite. But if there is time, I can read the second one later. This is sonnet number 60. This was written by Michelangelo for a young man that he fell in love with called Tommaso Cavalieri. And this was in 1532. So this was written about 30 years after Babar was, falling in love with Baburi. So there's a lot of men falling in love with men that is happening in the 16th century. Also, look at the way in which the sonnet queers knowledge, knowing, the idea of knowing. You know, I know, knowing. How does knowing become queer? That is something which I think Michelangelo does with tremendous sort of skill. Okay, so here is the sonnet. You know, my lord, that I know, that you know, that here I come more closely to enjoy you. And who I am, you know, I know, you know. What keeps us from exchanging greetings then? If all the hope you give me be not vain the great desire you bestow, let the wall break that stands between the two. For hidden troubles breed a double pain. If, my dear Lord, in you I only love what in yourself you love, show no disdain. One spirit's love is by another blessed. What in your lovely face I learn and crave, what human minds can scarcely understand. Whoever would know this must know death first. It's an extraordinary sort of play on the idea of knowledge. And look, he plays with it, Michelangelo, clever man. You know that I know, that you know, that I know, that you know. And by doing that, by sort of constantly playing on, you know that I know, that you know, that I know, he is creating a kind of queer complicity between Tommaso Cavalieri and himself, as if to say, oh, come on, you know, I know, you know. Knowledge is being queered. It is almost as though you know something about me, I know that you know, but the rest of the world don't know. So if the rest of the world don't know, why are you listening to the rest of the world? Why are you not talking to me? Because Michelangelo was very upset that Tommaso Cavalieri, it's true, Tommaso Cavalieri was a little embarrassed by the attention that he's getting from this sort of 57-year-old man. And Tommaso Cavalieri would occasionally sort of say, "Ha, dada, apnar songe pore kotha bolchi." Right? So Tommaso Cavalieri say, "Ha, dada, ami ekটু jai, apnar songe pore kotha bolbo." So Michelangelo was probably feeling neglected by Tommaso Cavalieri. But then in this poem, he sort of says, "But why are you running away from me?" Because he says very clearly that, what in your lovely face I learn and crave, what human minds can scarcely understand. When I look at your lovely face, it is not anything sexual. It is a spiritual exercise. It's a spiritual experience to look at your lovely face, which rather beggars the question that why should spirituality be so ostensibly tied to human physical beauty, is another question that you can very validly ask. So obviously, you know that Michelangelo he's being very sly. He's being very queer, right? He is revealing and hiding at the same time. And I think that is what queerness is. It is the simultaneous sort of, revealing and hiding. Finally, Walt Whitman, as I had promised you, that this is a poem that Walt Whitman was writing in 1860. When I heard at the close of the day, Walt Whitman's idea of America was a democracy, but the way in which he understood democracy was very much the democracy that he had learned about from ancient Greece. So this was a democracy in which men sort of associated with men. This is where men were sort of, forming their own society. And Walt Whitman also plays constantly with the idea of friend and lover. It is almost as though he uses friend and lover synonymously, which is an extraordinary trick that Walt Whitman does. And I regard that trick, again, as being very queer, because patriarchy will constantly try to binarize the friend from the lover, right? So therefore, a friend cannot be a lover and a lover can never be a friend. But Walt Whitman is consistently merging the two. He's collapsing the two. Okay, so here is the poem. When I heard at the close of the day. When I heard at the close of the day how my name had been received with plaudits in the capital, still it was not a happy night for me that followed. And else when I caroused or when my plans were accomplished, still I was not happy. But the day when I rose at dawn from the bed of perfect health, refreshed, singing, inhaling the ripe breath of autumn, when I saw the full moon in the west grow pale and disappear in the morning light, when I wandered alone over the beach and undressing, bathed, laughing with the cool waters and saw the sun rise, and when I thought how my dear friend, my lover, was on his way coming, oh, then I was happy. Oh, then each breath tasted sweeter. And all that day my food nourished me more, and the beautiful day passed well, and the next came with equal joy, and with the next at evening came my friend. And at night, while all was still, I heard the waters roll slowly, continually up the shores. I heard the hissing rustle of the liquid and sands as directed to me, whispering to congratulate me. For the one I love most lay sleeping by me under the same cover in the cool night. In the stillness in the autumn moonbeams, his face was inclined toward me, and his arm lay lightly round my breast. And that night I was happy. And that night I was happy. So look at the way in which Walt Whitman is collapsing friendship with love. He is destroying that particular very patriarchal binary, but also do note the way in which Walt Whitman is privileging the private self, and he is very much denigrating the public self. So he's saying that the plaudits at the Capitol did not impress me. That did not make me happy. So he is clearly trying to privilege, a kind of private happiness. And he's saying that the private happiness is much, much more valuable to the public happiness. Now, what makes it really ironical is that he is privileging private happiness at the cost of public recognition in a book of poems that he's publishing for public consumption. So he's therefore also queering the public and private space, right? And so therefore, once we start queering, this is what we do, is that we break down as many binaries as possible. We break down the structures that patriarchy has provided. And by doing that, we therefore try to inaugurate a kind of reading, a kind of writing, a kind of listening, a kind of speaking, which is going to be liberatory for everybody concerned. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Niladri, for that wonderful lecture. You really did justice both to the political and the literary side of the argument. Thank you for this again. I may now throw the session open for questions and comments.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Ivana Chaudhary. Yes, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, I have a question. If you
Sure.
permit, then I may ask.
Sure. Yes, I permit.
Sir, I have an observation as the
Yes.
term queer, it actually literally meaning is to disrupt or making something strange, or we can say
Yes.
twisting on the unsettled meaning. So the word
Hmm.
itself has a negative connotation, or we can say that it
Yes.
actually refuses the recognition of the defined categories, as you already mentioned, that such as gay,
Yes.
lesbian, and so on. So that have been
Yes.
denaturalized, or we can say it
Yes.
reduced to a discourse without paying attention to the effective what we can say material conditions that are the basis of the dominant discourses, right? So what's your
Yeah.
take in it, sir? Because the word itself has a negative connotation, so how we can apply it to such absolutely finely division in gender, the binary division?
Oh, no. I think what queer does from 1990 onwards is that it precisely does not respect the binary division of gender.
Yes.
Queer certainly says that a queer is extremely anti-binarist. And what queer is very post-structuralist. So therefore, queer basically says that, I am not going to respect the divisions that have been created because these divisions are created purely on the basis of language. It is just a play of words. And if we recognize that words are floating signifiers, as Derrida has taught us, then therefore, if they're floating signifiers, then there is no reason to tie a particular word to a particular anatomy. There is no reason to tie a particular word to a particular kind of body. So therefore, if we detach those words from those bodies, then we can use those words wherever possible. So therefore, queer is the politics of mobility, how terms
Okay.
become mobile. And by doing that, it is certainly a sort of breaking away from the pejorative meaning of the term, which was odd, strange, bizarre. So it is about the way in which language is mobilized in order to break down binaries. Yeah.
Okay, sir, thank you so much. Another
Thank you.
observation I have, sir. Uh,
Yes.
Just a minute.
We can probably come back to you because there may be
Yeah.
others who have questions. But
okay, okay,
Ivana, if
thank
there
you.
is, if there is time, we can certainly take your question later.
Okay, okay, thank you
Yeah,
so much.
just a minute. So I would just interrupt here a bit because there have been already some questions that have appeared in
So,
the chat
Ipendro,
box.
yeah, if you can just read out those questions and I'll answer them
Yeah,
one by one.
I will read those out.
Okay.
Devabroto Odhikari from Hooghly Women's College is asking, when we use the term patriarchy, can we always attach or associate it with oppression or repression? Also, can we have a generalized or a homogenized notion of patriarchy across cultures, religions, races, castes? That's the question.
I'm trying to understand that question, but if I understand the question correctly, then I think one can say that yes, patriarchy is absolutely, it is a structure of oppression, but one should also note that it is a structure of oppression that is very chronotopic. It is very, very chronotopic in the sense that it is very time and space specific. So patriarchy, I frequently talk about patriarchy as a constantly mutating drug resistant virus, because every time feminism comes up with a vaccine, patriarchy mutates itself and becomes drug resistant again. So patriarchy is constantly mutating as a virus. Feminism is constantly researching new vaccines, but these vaccines are not universally applicable. These vaccines are applicable, or these cures, as it were, these medicines are applicable very specifically. So they are applicable in certain socio-cultural contexts and not in others. So yes, patriarchy is universal, but its appearance and its manifestation is very time and space specific. Yes.
Yes. The next question is from Aparna Brahmachari, who has been our student. She asks about Bollywood movies. Is it a good sign? Is isn't it a good sign that homophobia is being treated as a theme in popular Bollywood movies? From the sense that it's addressing a large number of audience, so at least it's coming out of the closet.
Yes, I am. Well, Bollywood. I have a very love-hate relationship with Bollywood. I think on the one hand, I am happy for films like Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga, or indeed Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan. I am happy that these films are coming out, but again, I am very worried, as I just said, about popular gentrification of the queer. So now we are now having this mobilization of love into queer narratives, where there is going to be a celebration of the couple. And that, I think, is okay to begin with. But if this continues to be the case, then unfortunately, what's going to happen is that it is going to again become normative. We already have the term homonormative, which is that we are going to we will only accept gays and lesbians as long as they are sort of sexually, latched or attached to another person. So I'm very suspicious about the way in which couplehood can then become the new way of accepting the gay and the lesbian. So I'm happy about these narratives, but I would certainly want to see more narratives where sexuality is celebrated for itself without necessarily sentimentalizing it, without making it a part of a bigger patriarchal project where ultimately it's going to lead to marriage.
Yes. Salma Khatun's question, sir, you said that by erasing the gender category from the birth certificate, we can end the system of categorizing gender. But what about the name? How can we name a baby after birth?
Yes. Oh, very good. But clearly, this is not something that I said over here. You also appear to be a stalker. You have been hearing my previous lectures as well. Yes, of course, name is a problem. So therefore, I think, but you see, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Is that your name is something that you can actually change with a very quick affidavit. You can do that. You can certainly espouse a name of your own choosing. You can do that. The law allows you to do it. There is something called affidavit. The ease with which you change your name, do you have that same ease to change your gender? You don't. So that is where the problem is that we are even really, even changing of religion is not an issue. The changing of name is not an issue. The changing of address is not an issue. None of these are actually very, very complicated matters. But changing of gender becomes this enormously complicated thing, very difficult thing. My point is, why does it necessarily have to be so difficult?
Yes, Devashish Mitro is asking if queer has always been seen as a kind of resistance to the regimes of the normal, but then mere resistance can be another model of hegemonic power. And this is the last part I think you've already explained. Is it not necessary to have subversiveness for queer?
Yeah, I don't think that, I think what we really need to understand about resistance is that there are two kinds of resistance. So therefore, one kind of resistance is where it is openly confrontational. But what queer does is that queer is not necessarily openly confrontational. What queer does is that it basically says that, so the queer is not going to say, I'm not going to speak your language. I'm not going to use the words that you use. I'm going to invent my own language. Queer does not say that. Queer simply says, oh, your language is wonderful. Your language is great. However, I am going to use your language in a slightly different way. So therefore, it isn't hegemonic at all, patently not, because hegemony basically means that it is only my way in which the resistance can happen. Queer certainly does not say that. Queer never denigrates other kinds of resistance, but queer certainly says that this is a way of resistance which may yield better results. And of course, queer is not oppressive. So queer cannot qualify as being hegemonic. And also queer believes that there is no one way of being queer. There are several ways of being queer. Every single person can be queer in their own way. So there is no one prescription of being queer. And how you subvert is entirely up to you. So no, it isn't hegemonic, and it isn't overtly confrontational.
Niladri, I mean, lots of questions have come up. I mean,
Dear.
Do we take I think about 10 or 7, 8 questions are there. Anyway.
Okay. It entirely depends upon you. You know, as many questions as you can allow, I'm cool with it.
Fine. Sir, would you kindly say something on queer diaspora as a counter to globalization? Is asked by Masur Rahman.
Yes, I think that queer diaspora, well, I don't know whether it is actually a resistance to globalization, but I guess it can be. Yes, queer diaspora certainly has a kind of tremendous potential in order to subvert globalization, because of course, if you think that globalization in itself is inherently patriarchal, if you think that it is simply sort of imperialism in a different guise, then of course there is a kind of incipient patriarchy that is certainly a part of globalization, and the queer diaspora has a huge responsibility to reach out across nations to speak through other nations in order to create a certain critical mass, which is going to say that, there are other ways of consolidating. There are other ways of consumption. So then consumption can become political in many ways. And I think the queer diaspora plays a very important role, not only deciding how the consumption can happen, but also to configure identities that may not necessarily be acceptable to globalization. So yes, the diaspora can certainly perform that very, very powerful task.
The next question from Shayan Parial is about the effects that HIV/AIDS pandemic has had on queer movements.
Yes, oh gosh, this is enormous. I think what it really did was two things. Is that on the one hand, what the AIDS epidemic did was that it certainly galvanized a lot of gay men, the way in which perhaps they had not been galvanized before. Because suddenly being gay was literally a matter of life and death, literally. So therefore, I don't think that we take care of ourselves really sincerely till we know that there is a possibility that our dear ones may die, that we ourselves may die. And I think what that really did was that it galvanized the movement of gay men, and it certainly it brought together a lot of gay men and made them angry, brought them out into the streets. They were in open confrontation, as it were, with the government, asking for funding for AIDS research, which was simply not happening. So therefore, the government was not taking care. And we see that in many, many countries right now. Interestingly, countries that are led by extremely homophobic, heteronormative men who are today doing the exact same thing with the coronavirus. Leaders were basically saying that it's a minor problem, it does not require much attention, let's open up the business tomorrow, I am not going to wear a mask. So there is a certain masculinist way of governing the country, which is very visible in America, which is very visible in Brazil, to name just two. And we saw that exact same mindset during the epidemic. So it's very interesting how the world does not seem to have learned anything from the AIDS epidemic at all. We are making those exact same mistakes. So yeah, brilliant question.
Yes, thank you. Mizanur Rahman's question, it's not a I mean, basically what he's asking is there a Eurocentric limitation in dealing with the problematics of queering?
Oh, okay. Yes, initially there used to be, but you will be happy to know that, again, I will actually refer you to the journal GLQ, volume 26.3, because what is actually happening over here is that now an entire issue is being dedicated to the African queer customary. And this is a part of a much bigger, what is usually called theory from the South. So this is very much a part of the theory from the South project, where queer theorists have become acutely aware of the sort of Eurocentricity, of the Anglo-European centricity of queer theory, and there is now a tremendous effort at sort of making reparations for that. And you would be very interested to know that much of the initial queer theory that was formed was very ostensibly secular. And now there is an acknowledgement that one can actually mobilize local religions in order to reinvigorate the queer. So sometimes even local religions can become the site of very interesting subversive activity. So now the secular bias of much queer theory is being mediated, it is being critiqued. Local traditions, local cultures from the global South are becoming more and more important in queer theory. So that acknowledgement is being addressed very rapidly.
Yes. Next question from Polash Bishas. To what extent should the queer be adopted as a label for transgressive or socially unacceptable forms of thinking or acting?
It depends upon you. I think it is an entirely acceptable label. So therefore it depends on the politics that you wish to fit. It depends upon the political identity that you choose to claim for yourself. It is not for me to prescribe. But I will simply say that it's a perfectly valid political identity to have. Just as it is perfectly valid to be a communist, I think it is perfectly valid to be queer as well. So it's a personal matter. You need to decide whether the label suits you or not.
Pooja Chakraborty's question. The generic form of chicklit is frequently being criticized for being post-feminist texts, bearing certain negative connotations. Would you shed some light on this genre and also seeing the emergence of dude literature or dude lit dealing with the subject of masculinity?
Yes, I think chicklit and dude are very sort of interesting categories. I'm simply going to say interesting because every single text I think has got if you look deeply enough, there is a queer potential lurking in there somewhere in every single text, whether it is a novel of chicklit or dudelit, or whether it is a novel by Charles Dickens or a poem by Oscar Wilde. So therefore, yes, it may ostensibly seem to be patriarchal, but I think that there is a way in which one can subvert whatever patriarchal energy chicklit or dudelit has by reading it against the grain. So you can therefore turn it into a text that can suit you by identifying the queer there, and by doing that, to a certain extent, minimize or at least reduce the patriarchal energy that those texts have.
Yes, just a minute, sir. Shayoni Banerjee, are pride walks necessary for queer community of a particular location, or they promote discriminations more frequently?
Good Well, every time people talk about pride walks are necessary, I tell them that, heterosexuals have their pride walk around the year, and nobody seems to be having a problem with that somehow, because you see the wedding barat, the wedding procession, that is the pride walk of heterosexuality. So if you don't have a problem with the wedding barat that holds up the traffic while people are dancing, basically because celebrating, one man who is going to henceforth have sex with one, and somehow that is cause for major celebration. I don't see why a pride walk should not also celebrate the idea of men having sex with each other or women having sex with each other. So therefore, there is that. And also, I think that Pride Walk is important in the sense that it has now become, whatever it was previously, it has now become a site for tremendously intersectional politics. Yes, so Pride Walk is not now simply about sexuality. Pride Walk is now not simply about gender. If you were there for the last Pride Walk that took place in Kolkata, you will know that there were a vast number of placards that were protesting against the NRC, against the CAA. So therefore, they were protesting in favor of the rights of sex workers. So Pride Walk has become something that is much, much more inclusive, much, much more intersectional. I think to a certain extent it always was, but it has become even more so. So who you are is not defined by whether you take part in the Pride Walk or not. You are taking part in the Pride Walk because of your politics. So it isn't anymore about who you choose to sleep with. It is about what you choose to believe in.
We are winding up. Acha, Niladri, your audio seems to be breaking gradually.
Oh, okay. What I will do is take off my headphones, and maybe that will help. So I will take off my headphones. Is this helping?
Yeah, this is helping. Yes.
Yes. So what I will do is I am going to take off my headphones when I talk, but I will actually put on the headphones when I'm listening to you. I'll do that.
Yes. No, we will just wind up. Debolina, Chatterjee, and Anonymous's questions I'm merging. Debolina is asking about the representation of the LGBT community in the mobile games, which are actually oversexed representations in the name of inclusion. And Anonymous is also asking about Calvin Klein hiring a transgender model. Your takes on these?
Right. I'm just going to take the headphones off. I think I haven't actually researched mobile games, but I am absolutely certain that you're right, that there is an enormous amount of gender sexual stereotyping that is happening. But I think people are also beginning to protest against it. So I think the video game industry is now going to become much more much better informed about sexual diversity and gender diversity. It is going to happen. It will take time, but it will happen. And as far as the idea of Calvin Klein using a transgender model, I happen to believe that, we don't have any permanent enemies. We don't have any permanent friends. So therefore, even if capitalism becomes more inclusive, if that means greater trans visibility, I'm all for it. No politics is entirely pure. Every politics is sort of, mixed with other structures of power. One just has to be aware of the advantages that a certain visibility is providing and run with it. But at the same time, one can continue to criticize capitalism for the way in which, for example, pink washing happens as well. which is to say that there are companies that are going to put up the rainbow flag during June and talk about love is love and all of that. But in their employment policy, they are still very transphobic. They're still going to recruit only cis people. So I think there is a lot of pink washing that is happening, or indeed a lot of rainbow washing that is happening. But then again, one should celebrate the whatever steps that capitalism takes to increase visibility of the sexually diverse and the gender diverse.
I think you have also answered Richard Chaudhary's question partly, which was that capitalists are just creating a market for pink capitalism. Do I repeat, sir? Capitalists are creating a market for pink capitalism by a kind of misrepresenting the society as an ally to the queer community. And this is something that you have partly already addressed to a certain extent. And this last question is from the Holocaust discourses, how Jews were massacred by the Nazis. So don't you think that same importance has been given to the massacring of the homosexuals by the Nazis?
Yes. Oh my God, I did not expect this question. Thank you so much for this question. Yes, very often when we talk about the Nazi Holocaust, we talk about the Jews. Some histories will also talk about the Gypsies, but a major sort of straight washing of history has happened, as a result of which we simply don't know that, we are not aware that a lot of homosexual men, pointedly not lesbians. So this is something that I think I have to stress on, is that not lesbians. The lesbians that were prosecuted by the Nazis, it was done so because of their politics, not because of their sexuality. But gay men were ostensibly sort of, taken into concentration camps because of their sexuality. And you may be interested to know that several decades ago in Amsterdam, they had this pink triangle that was inaugurated. The pink triangle, I was lucky to have visited one corner of that triangle. That pink triangle is celebrated as a permanent memorial to the homosexual men who died in the Nazi Holocaust. And there, of course, there is this wonderful play, Shomipendra, because he's interested in theater, he may be interested to know that there's this remarkable play called Bent, B-E-N-T, which is actually about two men finding love in a Nazi concentration camp. So there is some work that is available on the way in which homosexual men were killed in concentration camps, but not enough people know about it. So thank you so much for that amazing question.
Yes, I mean, thank you, Niladri. We are at the end of the questions. We are not taking any more questions. I will just mention one thing to my students, primarily of the University of Gour Bongo. I mean, that I should have said this earlier at the beginning. Niladri is my sir. That was, long time back when we were
about 100 years ago.
When we were students at Kalyani University. We were greatly, shaped by the way you taught, the way you addressed issues. I mean, the brilliance has become greater, I would say, over these years.
Oh, thank you. almost as great as my hair.
Okay, Amida, you can conclude.
Okay. Now we have come to the fag end of this session. I must thank Professor Niladri R. Chatterjee for speaking wonderfully on certain issues. He has tackled many issues during his lecture, especially the problematic of categorization and the exclusivist agenda involved therein. And you see, I was reminded of many theoreticians, starting from the Lavender Minutes controversy to obviously Germaine Greer. And, especially the way he tackled the question with patience and with wisdom that really made me very, very happy for my students and scholars and the members of the audience that have been privileged to hear him speak and answer questions. Now, I must thank the audience as well for being here and enriching us with a vibrant interactive session. The questions actually are in no way inferior insofar as they contribute to the level of the program and they elicit certain answers that stay with us for times to come. You know, this online lecture series has really enriched us because scholars from India and abroad have contributed exceptionally thought-provoking lectures, and as a part of this, the next lecture that we will have day after tomorrow will be on an entirely different topic. Dr. Asantha U. Attanayake Barboric from Kalyani University is going to talk about language attitude, anxiety, and the role of English literature students. So I must end here by inviting you all to that session as well. Thank you, Niladri Dar. Thank you, Professor Niladri R. Chatterjee, if I may be more formal. And thank you, audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I hope to see many of you very soon. Bye-bye.